Genesis 26, let's read verses 17 to 23. So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. He gave them the names that his father had given them, but when Isaac's servants dug in the valley, found there a well of spring water. The herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called it Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." From there he went up to Beersheba. Now, you remember the story is Isaac comes to Gerar. God has promised Isaac at the very beginning of chapter 26 that the promises of Abraham are now his. So if he stays, he needs to stay in the promised land, not go to Egypt. Don't make the mistake that your father did. So he stays, and through the famine, God blesses him. And the secret to his success seems to be these wells his father had dug that Isaac now took possession of, and the Lord blessed him, right? So you're in the middle of a famine. Access to water is critical to survival. And Isaac seems to have great access to water, and he's able to grow his crops and everything else. So you remember that in verse 16, he's essentially kicked out by Abimelech. You know, you become a source of contention. It's not worth it. You know, your tax dollars aren't worth it anymore. You need to leave. So he, in verse 17, he departs from Gerar. Now, what this means is he returns to Gerar. So remember that in verses 3 to 4, God promises them land. In verse 6, he enters Gerar. Verse 16, he leaves Gerar. Verse 17, he returns to Gerar. Right? There's going to be a lot of movement here that's going to be difficult to keep track of. However, notice verse 17, it's not that he just returned back to where he was. He returns to what's called the valley of Gerar. I assume those are close to each other, but different locations. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the geography of the Middle East or even where Gerar is. So perhaps there is some gap between verse 16 and 17. He's kicked out and then he returns. And so I don't know what happened in between there. That's the way I'm reading it, and I could certainly be wrong. Regardless, he finds himself in this valley. And well, while he's there, he digs the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham's father. I assume those were the ones that they had filled up with dirt. I don't know. And he gave them the same name. So he's in the valley. He regains access to those old wells, okay? So here is a guy who's wealthy. He wasn't as wealthy when he came, got all this money, leaves, and then apparently comes back, and then reopens the secret to his success. Remember what we said about envy was the Philistines didn't just kick him out and took the source of life. They destroyed the source of abundance in life and just kicked him out, right? And so they never, that's the problem. Envy destroys, it never creates. If you want proof of that, look at the United States of America. All we talk about is what we are to tear down, not what we are to build up. And we think that tearing down will actually build up. What we do when we tear down is we just destroy. And out of that will come corruption and violence and everything else. I mean, we've been tearing down the family for generations. And what have we found to replace it? Government hasn't done a very good job of replacing it, but maybe that's just me. So notice here, he has the wells and he's here in the valley. And so in the famine, the rights to water becomes a very serious and complicated issue. Now to us, because none of us are thirsty, as I say that, let me grab a drink of water, right? None of us are too worried about this, right? Because we're not fighting over this. So the modern equivalent that came to mind is oil. There are questionable, our borders, particularly with Canada, there's some locations that there is still some discussion over, is this part of Canada or is this part of the United States, okay? Now, no one cares. No one cares. No one is going to run for state senator or president of the United States over that is our land and not Canada's. However, if they discover a large amount of oil on that land, watch what the lawyers do then. Watch what the politicians do then. I was in Breckinridge County when oil was found in the southern part. Now, I ministered in the southern part of Breckinridge County. It was Breckinridge County, Ohio County, whatnot. And one of the guys at the church I served at, briefly before we came here, oil had been found on his land. And he was retired, and so he essentially started his own business. The Lord really blessed him. Now, it wasn't Saudi Arabia or Qatar or anything like that, but there was an influx of people coming to the area. I noticed because the guy that worked for PVA, they were getting a lot of requests for zoning requests and whatnot because people were wanting to pump oil. One of the other members of the church I served at briefly, he was convinced there was oil underneath his land, absolutely convinced. And he had them survey it 1,000 times, right? And every time they said, we can't find none, he said, well, you're not looking hard enough. You need, right? He was just convinced. Why? Because it's oil. Right? I mean, there's money there. And the way he described it is, you do nothing, you make money. Basically what it is. That just keeps pumping. And he said it was like $100 a day, $100 an hour. Something, it was a crazy amount of money he was making. Not doing anything, right? There's one guy who was retired. Didn't need it. Right? He's retired from military and he was retired from the other job he had. He was doing fine financially. And then it's like, here's a bunch of more money. It's just going to keep pumping into your bank account, right? I mean, it's oil. That's a small amount of discovered there, right? Now imagine water in famine. Now who has the rights? Add to that, the guy that discovers all this, he ain't from around here. He's an alien. He's an immigrant. He's a sojourner. He has little to no rights in the area. He's already been kicked out once. And now this conflict is just getting worse and worse. So you'll see in verse 19 to 20, they redig those wells, right? And then they dig in the valley, verse 19, and there they found an additional source of water. But you need to notice there's a description there. It's not just they found a cistern of water. It's basically what a well is, a cistern. What they found was a spring of water. That is much more preferential. Right? Now what you have is fresher water, cleaner water, running water. Right? This is good. You want running water. This is very good. And so naturally then, when word gets out, hey, that stranger from out of town, now he's got more water, and it's a spring of water. And then someone will say, well, that ain't his land. That's my grandpappy on my mama's side land. That's ours. Let's go get it. Who does he think he is? Right? So this becomes a matter of real dispute. Now, let's pause here and think about what we're really discussing in light of the biblical narrative. In Genesis, the blessing of God is when he turns a wilderness into an oasis. And we've looked at these examples 1,000 times, right? The Garden of Eden is one. So you have wilderness on the outside. You have Eden. Inside Eden is a garden. How is that described? Rivers run right through it. Right? So you imagine the trees with the river there. So you have the tree of life with the source of life, okay? And then there are other stories. The one that comes to mind, we talked about this last week, when Hagar put Ishmael in the under the bush. She goes off to die of exhaustion and whatnot. She looks over, or the angel of the Lord shows her a spring. So what you have is an oasis in the wilderness. You have a garden. It's a source of life. Well, God has promised Isaac, if you stay here, I will bless you. And there's no rational reason for him to stay because the famine was so extreme. However, everywhere he goes, God creates for him a garden, an oasis. Because an oasis is where trees are. If you're in the wilderness, if you're in the desert, okay, this is my advice to you, okay? So you're out in Utah and you're stuck somewhere, okay? What you need to look for is anything green. Because what you're going to find is not a random tree in the middle of the dirt. What you're going to find is a bunch of green things. And where those green things are is water. That's how they're growing, right? I didn't know it was common sense. You have an oasis in the middle of this. So Isaac's out there just digging. And it just so happens he finds a spring of water no one else had found. Here, God is blessing Isaac in the land. He's given him the land. The problem is the land isn't his yet. And so those who own the land now come to throw a fit. So you have conflict between the Gerarites and Isaac's employees. So what should be a garden in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of this famine, turns into conflict. This is the story arc of the Bible, of human history. Where God provides a garden, man finds reason to quarrel. So think about it. The Garden of Eden, like as good as life could ever get for us. What did we do with that? We destroyed it. And this is the pattern throughout the narrative. God gives his grace and blessing. We destroy it. Well, ask your pardon. By the way, I've entitled this Well. That was from Mark, right? Well. So that was free. That joke, you do with that whatever it is you want. But speaking of jokes, there is a song that came to mind when I was looking at this story. Okay? Let me see if you're familiar with it. Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food. And up through the ground came a bubbling crude. Oil, that is. Texas tea. Love that. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolks said, Jed, move away from there. Said, California, that's worth the price of admission. California is the place you ought to be. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars. Right? That's what you got going on here. Right? Except he doesn't go to California. He hangs around. Now, he calls this place, this last place, Esek, which means conflicts. And the conflict is over who has the rights to claim that property. Now, naming something is the first step of that. We did this when the Europeans came over to America. Jamestown was named after King James. Virginia is named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, right? Maryland is named after Mary, the mother of Jesus. So they're all Catholics are there, right? Pennsylvania named after William Penn. We could just keep going. So you would say, I declare this in the name of King George, or whatever it is. So that's still a modern way of doing this. So he's naming it to make some sort of claim of authority. Well, in verse 21, guess what happens? They dig another well. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that, so he called it Sitnah. Sitnah means hostility or accusation. So we have those first three wells, and now we're going to get another three sources of water. And here in verse 22 is this other well. He moved from there, so notice he's just bouncing all over the place because of conflict. Dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it, so he named it Rehoboth. Rehoboth means wide places or wide streets. Now, you need to remember that Isaac is a sojourner. He has little to no rights to anything. So when there's conflict, his options are quite limited. He can stake a claim, but he's going to lose it in the end. So he has to move and dig another well. And guess what? God provides for him there. Conflict, right? And he's going to go dig another one, right? And eventually he digs a well, finds water, and there's no conflict. I don't know why there's not conflict, but there's not. So he names it wide places or wide streets. By the way, Rehoboth is a fairly commonplace name in the Bible. It is one of the 4 cities built by Asher or Nimrod, depending on how you read it, located near Nineveh, in case you want to see the reference. Oh, I forgot. I put the Beverly Hillbillies up there. You're welcome. There he is. I mean, Grandma's the best character of that. I don't care what you say. Genesis 10, here it is that Rehoboth is first mentioned in the Bible. Another one is it's a city of Shaul, one of the kings of the Edomites. So there you go. To that. Now, when I read this, I won't put their picture up there, that Rehoboth means wide places. Is there a song that comes to mind? What's that? Come on, it's got to be sticking on. Dixie Chicks, wide open spaces, ain't it? So what happens is Isaac moves to Rehoboth to have enough room to make his own mistakes. Right? Come on. Y'all don't know the Dixie Chicks. I don't blame you, but I don't know. Yeah, they're chicks. Are they chicks now? Just the chicks.
They got in trouble when it was bad to talk bad about the president.
Yeah.
Now they're cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, man, this country. Yeah. Yeah. They do have one album. It was the album without the, they didn't have drums in it. Is that what it was? Amanda bought that. We were dating. I actually kind of liked it. It had some good songs on it. I can't tell you what any of the songs were. Is that the album they redid an old song? I'm not going to think of it. Why even try? They had a song about a soldier on there, maybe? You country music fans, you Dixie Chicks fans, maybe you can help me out.
Was this a newer one?
No, this would be back. I graduated 03, so somewhere around there.
Yeah.
We were dating. So what were we talking about? Oh, yeah, Jesus. So now he's got a place. He can sort of stake a claim to it, right? No one's bothering him. The neighbors aren't crazy, all that good stuff. So then what we get in verses 23 to 25 is God shows up. And so what he's found is God provided an oasis in the wilderness, but mankind showed up, turned it back into a wilderness. Finally, he finds a place where he can raise his family, grow his crops, raise his cattle and sheep, whatnot. And so God is going to bless him here. So in verse 23, he meets God. From there, he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there, called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there. And there, Isaac's servants dug a well. So this is at least 4 wells. I'm losing track of them. That is built, okay? So some of this language will probably sound familiar if you've been tracking along with us here in Genesis. So he moves to Beersheba. Again, he's a sojourner, so moving around he's very nomadic. Now this city, Beersheba, is an important town in the story of Abraham. It was in Beersheba in Genesis 21 that Abraham made peace with Abimelech. Remember, Abimelech is the story. Abraham goes, lies about his wife being his sister, all that, so he makes peace. Isaac will later go to Abimelech, lie about his wife being a sister. He's not quite made peace with Abimelech. Abimelech's kicked him out, and all the other Philistines causing problems. But now he's at a place of peace, wide open places, Dixie Chicks. And so this is an important place. Now I want you to notice this, because we're going to come back to this. When Abraham goes to Beersheba and makes peace, notice what Abraham does. He plants a tree. He calls upon the name of the Lord. Now, we talked about this back then. I know you've already forgotten about it. In Genesis, where you see a tree and the presence of God, what are you to think of? It's the garden. Yeah, that's the theme of Genesis. God creates gardens or oases out of wilderness. Or as we like to sing, God creates gardens out of graves. Is that the song? Chris Lasley always had to sing that song. Gardens from graves or something like that. That's the pattern we're seeing. Now remember this, because we're going to come right back to it with Isaac. It is in Beersheba that Abraham is living when he marches out to go offer Isaac as a sacrifice in Genesis 22. Now, it's not in Beersheba he does it. He goes actually to where Jerusalem will be found. Remember that at the end of 2 Samuel, David does the census and all that, and then he builds an altar. He buys land. That property is where Abraham offered Isaac, and it is the foundation to what will become the temple. Well, all that starts Beersheba. Abraham leaves. He makes peace, plants a tree. He leaves Beersheba to go offer Isaac, and that's when the angel of the Lord intervenes. Why? Because remember, God will provide a lamb. The angel of the Lord provided a ram because the angel of the Lord, pre-incarnate Jesus, becomes the lamb who will die in Jerusalem. Okay? So hopefully not lost yet. The Bible is just like it's written by God. Notice in verse 24 the phrase, the Lord appeared. This is clearly a theophany. You'll find this language all over Genesis. There are several theophanies, or the appearance of God, and these appearances are really to be seen in a type of bodily form, right? So whether or not it's physical bodily form, but what you're not having is a burning bush experience. Rather, the Lord appears in some physical sense. Now, I don't think we should take that too literally. I mean, we could, I guess, but the text isn't clear. So here's 4 examples. Notice God appears to Abraham in Genesis 12. This is right after the covenant is made. God then appears to him. And remember, what does Abraham do? Is this is in the context of him lying about his wife being a sister. He's doing the same thing here. Genesis 17, this is where God reaffirms the covenants. I know you're 99 years old, but you're going to have a boy. And then in chapter 18, God appears to him, notice, by trees. Important detail, right? When you see trees, there's a source of life. So you have the presence of God and trees there with Abraham. Okay? And then 26:2, God had appeared to Isaac, which we saw several weeks ago. And you remember that opened up the Abrahamic covenant with Isaac. So you've seen a pattern here. When God shows up, it usually has to do with his covenant with his patriarchs. And often language of the garden is associated with it. Trees, particularly with Abraham, we see trees as a big one. We'll see a similar one with Isaac. By the way, there are other theophanies in Genesis. There's a very obvious one that I didn't think of until I was studying this week. And that is the Garden of Eden, right? Duh, right? Remember that God walks through the garden, hangs out with them. He walks with me and talks with me. That was Adam and Eve's favorite song, right? And there in the garden, you have the trees, right? This pattern is all over Genesis. There's also Christophanies, or at least what I think are Christophanies. These are where Christ appears himself to mankind. Now here is when the angel of the Lord shows up. Let me show you one example of Genesis 16. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness. And this is, I think this is the first time she's kicked out by Abraham. Then later she'll get kicked out again. Now, I want you to notice there, Hagar is the mother of Isaac's brother. And Christ appears not at a tree, but at a spring. So the emphasis here, the garden, the evidence of the garden isn't that a tree can grow, but that water is there. Life. Water is life. Okay? That's why if you look at a map of Africa, you're going to see a big old Sahara desert. Where does it end to the north? The Nile River is where that ends, Egypt. Okay? Water is a source of life. Now, this is Isaac's last theophany. Jacob will experience some as well. We'll cross those bridges when we get there. But I want you to notice what God says. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you. Will bless and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So notice the appearance of God is associated with covenant making. Just like Abraham in Genesis 12, 17, and 18. And like with Isaac in Genesis 26, verse 2. When God appears, it is to secure his covenant. This is an unconditional covenant. Despite the frustrations, the circumstances, and the conflict our patriarchs are involved in, God reassures he will keep his end of the deal. Abraham was promised land and lineage. Isaac is promised basically land and lineage. He doesn't have boys yet. I mean, I know Jacob's introduced, but in the narrative, Jacob's not playing a part yet. Now, notice the language, I am the God of Abraham. Now, this is not the divine name of Yahweh, like in Exodus 3, I am that I am, where God gives his name to Moses, the great I am. This is a more generic word for I am. In fact, the same language is used, or the divine name is used in this chapter's verse 28, if you want to see an example of it. The Lord, Yahweh. However, what's interesting is Jesus picks up on this language. Not this verse, but this is the beginning of it. I won't take time to read the whole passage. Matthew 22, starting verse 23 and following. You remember the story. The Sadducees are trying to trick Jesus. And remember the Sadducees, they are always Sadducee because they didn't believe in any of the books of the Old Testament outside of... I'm glad two of you are picking up and following.
I'm laughing and laughing at you.
I spoke at an event at First Baptist Owington Monday. They did a deacon appreciation thing. Of course, Dad's a deacon again. And I made a joke about First Baptist Ephesus. Ephesus. And I just went on, right? I've told that joke here 1,000 times, right? It's obviously they're not Baptist churches. I mean, it was the same thing where it was one person 10 seconds later did a small little chuckle. And then that made other people rethink what it is that was said. So and then it just sort of went around. I paused like, yeah, it took you long enough, didn't it? It's not even that funny of a joke, which now that you've taken so long to get it, is even funnier to me, okay?
I don't want to encourage you.
Right, yeah, wouldn't want that. So the Sadducees come, and they only believe in the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They do not believe in supernatural beings, angels, demons, that sort of stuff. And they don't believe in the final resurrection. You go, you're buried in Sheol, that's it, okay? The Pharisees believed in all that. So the Sadducees come to Jesus and say, okay, the law says that if you're married, you don't have kids, and your husband dies, you marry his brother. What if after 7 brothers, they're all dead, right? What do you do then? Well, you call the cops is what you do, okay? And she needs to get herself a good liar, okay? She's going to need it, okay? I just don't understand. They all ate my chicken salad and they all died. But what they say then is, in the resurrection, whose husband or whose wife is she, okay, of the 7 men? Remember how Jesus answered? One, he says there's no giving in a marriage in heaven. Okay. His main argument from the Bible is taken from not this text ultimately, but really kind of from this text. He says, what does Genesis say? Remember, they believe in Genesis. God reveals himself as, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You remember the application he made? God didn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the first time we see this language here. I am the God of your father, Abraham. And Jesus applies it and says, if God is, right now in the present tense, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're still around because of the resurrection. Right? And we use that language, right? When we speak of, we might say the God of, John Gill, great Baptist commentator. But we will think in those languages that you've heard me say the same gospel we preach here today, same gospel preached back then and in other ends of the world. We still use some of that language today. So Jesus picks up on this. This is an important scene. But notice it's not just I am the God of Abraham. It's I am the God of your father, or I am your father, right? And this is the first time this language is used in the Bible. I am the God of Abraham, your father. Now, this will play a role. It's not the last time. I don't want to read all these, so that's why the print is so small. That God will say, Abraham, your father. Isaac or Jacob will later say, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, all that sort of stuff. So this is the genesis of father language. Now, the Jews wouldn't often speak of God as father. They would in Second Temple Judaism. So when Jesus comes and says, my father, blank, it's quite radical language. It's quite striking. Because at best, the Jew would say, our father. Jesus came and said, no, it's my father. But the real genesis of that comes back all the way here. And he says, I will bless you and multiply you. This is the second affirmation of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, what is the blessing in Genesis? It's land and lineage, but particularly, remember, children are the blessing. Isaac has no kids yet. And verse 25, this is significant. So he has this experience, this theophany. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Now, the presence of God is sacred ground. Is that fair enough? I mean, I don't think that's too far-fetched. It is why religions have always created sacred space in areas where they believe the divine has appeared to mankind. Right? So the early Christians, when Constantine, I think it was his mother who traveled around and found all these monasteries and churches on places. So you can go where Jesus supposedly was born, right? And there's a church there. Go where they think the empty tomb was, or where Mount Sinai, there's the Sinai Monastery, right? And so you go around and you can find these, supposedly where these events took place, and there's some sort of sacred space there, a church, a monastery, a university, something like that. That is common throughout history. We do that a little bit with significant historical events. Every county, every community in this state has a history marker, right? On this spot, this happened. You can go to Georgetown, and the original site of what would eventually become Georgetown College, kind of, sort of. There's a historical marker about my ancestor. It says he founded a classical school. It didn't last very long, but you can go right in downtown Georgetown. It's that historical marker. And Georgetown is, you throw a couple stones, hit a golf ball, whatever, and there's Georgetown, right? But it was started right here in this little space. It's in a person's backyard. We still do that today. Now, how does he mark sacred ground? He builds an altar is the first thing he does. Now, this is the pattern we see throughout Genesis. Genesis 8, Noah builds an altar. Here he took the clean animals, right, from the ark, because it wasn't just 2 by 2. Abraham did in Genesis 12 after God appeared to him. In Genesis 13, when Abraham went to the oaks of Mamre, we saw this verse earlier. What did he do when he encountered a theophany? He built an altar. And in Genesis 22, Abraham builds the altar before God shows up. He has to build the altar, put Isaac on it. But Isaac isn't offered on the altar. No one is. But now remember, that's the location of the eventual temple where Christ will be cast out to be crucified. Right? So Abraham builds an altar, but nothing is laid there until Solomon builds the temple. And the last true offering of sacrifice, true one, was the Passover lamb, Jesus Christ. All right, so this is the pattern. When God shows up, there is an altar. Isaac does the same thing here, but I want you to notice what is different here. You have the presence of God. You have an altar where sacrifices are made. And notice, Isaac's servants dug a well. What an interesting little detail. Did anyone fight over it? Was there any conflict over it? Was it near a spring? No details. I think this entire story is annoying. And it is an annoying story about how he went out and dug a well. People got mad. Went out and dug a well. I can keep track of where Isaac's going in the story, right? He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. And everywhere he goes, he digs a well. He finds water, and people throw a hissy fit. So he leaves and he builds a well, and people throw a hissy fit. He finally builds a well, and everything seems fine. He names it Rehoboth, and the Dixie Chicks come by and sing songs, and then he leaves that again. And while he's in Beersheba, he encounters God. And when God showed up, what did they find? Water in the wilderness. You see the parallels. When Abraham encounters God, there's a tree. And you can't have a tree without water. When Isaac encounters God, he finds water, the source of life. The story of the Bible is how God takes wilderness life, whether it's a literal desert for the patriarchs, or whether it is human wilderness of brokenness and conflict and envy and pride and jealousy. And even out of that, he creates an oasis. He turns graves into gardens. I think that's the point. We know nothing about this last well except when God shows up, he gives life. So it's not an accident that soon we're going to meet Jacob, because that's the ultimate fulfilling of the promise. That's the beauty of it, is we see the garden. Let me give you just 3 quick applications, and then we'll call it a day. Conflict is fueled by envy and jealousy. We've seen this. The first exodus of Isaac from Gerar was a result of envy. This one seems to be fueled by jealousy, greed, and entitlements. And I do think there is immigrant problems with Isaac. They see him as the outsider, the alien, and that is still a problem even today. And also, wherever there is wealth, there are gold diggers. You realize that most people who win the lottery are bankrupt within 5 years. Let me tell you, one of the problems is they discover they have family they've never met. Here's the real reality when it comes to wealth. Far majority of people cannot handle it. Those who can't handle a family budget cannot handle millions of dollars. There's a fascinating 30 for 30 ESPN put together. I think it's called Broke. It traces the story of bankruptcy so common among athletes after they retire. And a lot of it is this sort of stuff. Right? Where there's money, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of greed, a lot of entitlements. A lot of entitlements. Secondly, difficult circumstances do not mitigate God's providence or promises. Isaac was a sojourner, yet God promised him a home, right? So remember that God promised Abraham land and lineage when he was a sojourner and he was beyond the age of childbearing. But he believed it. So faith should not be determined by circumstances, by what you can see, but rather that God is a God who keeps his promises. And God shows up throughout the Genesis narrative at times to remind the patriarchs, this will happen, stick with me. And what God has been doing with Isaac is everywhere he goes, he finds water. No one else can seem to find water, but everywhere Isaac goes, he finds water for the simple reason God is keeping his promises. All right, thirdly, the main point of the story of the Bible, so here, is that God comes down. This is in the text. We didn't read everything that God said to him. Go back to verse 24. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father, fear not. Now, later, I had it up there, we didn't spend time on it. The language is, Jacob will say, Abraham your father and the fear of Isaac, something like that, right? I think it comes from this verse. So, do not fear, feareth notteth, right? Fear not, I am with you. What does that sound like now that it's December? It's the Christmas story. This is known as the Emmanuel principle. I am with you. Now, in this story, God is literally with Isaac. It's a theophany. I'm standing right here. The application is God is always with Isaac. The evidence of it is the digging of the well. Where God is, there is an oasis. There's a garden. And Isaac's circumstances do not mitigate that assurance. The same is still true today. Where there is the believer, God is to be found. Simply because we have his word and we have his spirit. The incarnation is evidence that Christianity is founded on the idea, not that man ascends to the heavens, that's religion, but that the heavens will descend to man, that's the gospel. And Isaac sees this in the flesh. Here is God before me, and he's always with me. What's one of the last words Jesus gave according to Matthew? Behold, I am with you, always to the end of the age. Just as he was with them, helping them fish and whatnot, so too Jesus is with us as we go on our missions. That's the good news of the passage. God's turning graves into gardens. He is still with us. All right, how about we end it there?